The average human will walk 216,262,500 steps in their lifetime. So what would you do if you only had 100? My name is Graeldon, I'm on an impossible journey to review every Steam game in alphabetical order, and today we're playing 100 Steps. Let's begin. The world has fallen, monsters run rampant, but the gods are watching. And those that surpass their challenge may join their pantheon, follow their rules, and climb to the top. That is the challenge presented by 100 Steps, a roguelike game developed by Endorth Studio and published by Bite Size and Kinda Brave, and released on Steam on the 18th of October 2023. This is one of those instances where all three names link to the same page on Steam, but after doing a little digging, I did manage to find Endorth games on itch. Here, they've released a number of games and appear to be a regular Game Jam participant. While browsing their profile, one game in particular caught my eye, titled 100 Steps to Victory. Judging from the description and screenshots, it's pretty safe to say that this is effectively a prototype for 100 Steps, their first, and as of writing, only project to release on Steam. And this makes me kind of optimistic because it means they've taken a concept that they felt had potential and then fleshed it out and refined it to be suitable for a full release. Or at least I hope that's what happened. So let's dive in and take a look at what the game has to offer. On the absolute surface level, 100 Steps is a turn-based roguelite with a limited number of turns and an unlock-based progression system. Below the surface, there is a lot more complexity, which we'll absolutely get into for both better and worse. As always, let's start with the title screen, and I have to say that the first impressions are positive. The art looks clean and suits the fantasy tones of the game, the UI elements are similarly thematic, and the music creates a sense of peace with some fantasy adventure undertones. This carries through to the main menu, and here there's a bit more going on. Firstly, we have a massive Enter the Tower button. No prizes for guessing that takes you into the actual game. Above that, we have several buttons that take you into the different progression and unlock systems, more on those later. To the right, we have a global leaderboard. I'll let you know where I ended up later. In the top right are achievements and settings, and at the bottom is the how to play section. In terms of settings, I'm pleased to report that it has everything you would expect for a game of this style, although the only graphical setting is the resolution. There are also separate sound sliders and rebindable controls for both keyboard and gamepads. Yes, this game can be played with a gamepad, but I wouldn't recommend it, as it's basically just emulating the keyboard controls by moving the cursor with the right thumbstick. I appreciate that it's here though. Right, prepare for an info dump because we're moving on to the tutorial section. Now before we get into the mechanics, you may notice from this point onwards some funky stuff happening with the cursor and object selection on screen. I'm not sure why this happened because it certainly wasn't an issue when playing the game itself, so I can only guess that it's an issue due to a difference between the game resolution and recording resolution that's caused them to get out of sync. Rest assured, it's fine when playing the game. Now, in a bit of a weird design choice, rather than the how to play section opening with the first item, the basics, it starts on the buff section. Not the end of the world, but a sign of things to come, unfortunately. This section covers everything from movement and combat, to buffs and debuffs, to vendors and upgrade mechanics, and even some mechanics that haven't been unlocked yet, like altars and the notebook. If you do decide to pick this game up, I would recommend reading through this first, as there is no in-game tutorial, and you'll need to know a lot of this to get anywhere. Or you can dive in headfirst and see what happens, I'm not your boss. Returning to the main menu, you'll notice that most of the buttons are currently locked, but we can access the feats section. These are basically mini achievements or quests to work towards that will result in new unlockables, essentially another form of meta progression. We have a few more screens to get through before we have actual gameplay though, and the first is the character selection. Initially, you only have one to choose from, the Adventurer, but there are 9 more to unlock, and each has some interesting lore that accompanies them, as well as different starting gear and stats. The first time you enter the tower, you're shown a quick overview of the gameplay loop, and it's pretty much what you'd expect. Open chests, find gear, kill things, climb the tower. You're then shown how equipment works, and it's pretty simple. Items can be added to one of 3 inventory slots. Press the corresponding number to use that item. Simple enough, but as you'll soon find, having access to only 3 items means you'll be making a lot of tough choices regarding equipment, especially considering that items only have a limited number of uses before being destroyed. Do you go for the high damage weapons that have a low number of uses and hope to find more on the way? Or do you go for the high durability items to ensure you're never without a weapon? These choices are meaningless if we don't know how to progress, so let's quickly go over some key info and mechanics. As a reminder, we're climbing a tower. What we see at the moment is a single floor made up of hexagonal tiles. Pressing W changes to movement mode, and because we currently have a movement speed of 1, each tile costs 1 step. Steps are displayed at the top of the screen, and honestly, it's easier to think of these as actions. In typical roguelike fashion, everything is turn-based, with your actions taking place before the enemies do, but everything is shown at the same time in order to minimize downtime waiting for your opponents to move. Weapons have set ranges, such as melee being a single tile, or bows, wands, and tomes that allow for long-range strikes or area of effect attacks. Pressing 1, 2, or 3 will equip the weapon in that slot, and thankfully changing weapons doesn't use any steps or count as a turn. This helps keep combat dynamic and flowing, but I have to say it was a pain to remember to press W each time I wanted to resume moving. There were so many instances where I hit a chest and destroyed it instead of opening it, that it was getting a little bit ridiculous, and I wasn't sure whether to blame the game or early onset dementia. Speaking of chests, these are super important and essentially your main way of gearing up if you want to make any progress. While killing enemies will reward you with a small amount of gold and sometimes an item, opening chests will present you with between 1 and 3 rewards and allow you to choose one or take a small amount of gold if none of the options take your fancy. However, chests need to be opened within a limited number of steps, otherwise they just yeet themselves into the void.
Oh, hail the void!
After clearing a floor, or when you are otherwise ready to move on, use a door to move to the next area. If you ever forget which floor you're on, it's displayed at the top of the screen next to the step counter. Floors are completely randomized, to an extent anyway. The layout is always the same, but the number of traps, chests, enemies, and NPCs such as the merchant or blacksmith are random, but the difficulty is based on the current floor. The higher you go, the tougher things become, but so do you. However, the gear doesn't work in the same way. In my experience, it's best to take your time on the lower levels hunting for the best loot you can find, and then blitz through the later levels. That said, there's only so far that tactic will take you, but more on that in a moment. Now that I'm on the 3rd floor, you can see the merchant, who basically acts like a chest that charges you gold to take an item. Currently they vanish after purchasing something, but they can be upgraded to allow more purchases before they leave. Not that you'll have the gold to afford that right now anyway. There is one more NPC you might stumble across, which is the blacksmith. At the moment, the only thing they can do is repair your equipment, but that is also possibly the single most important function in the entire game. The other important thing on this screen is the blue swirly looking tile that is unfortunately hidden behind a pillar, so hopefully my editor will work some magic to show you what it actually looks like. These, and I cannot stress this enough, are super important, because they unlock new things, permanently. The first one you find will unlock the trinket system. Trinkets are essentially passive items, and you can carry 4 at any time. Each one provides a small stat boost, and they can be upgraded at the blacksmith to enhance them further. More importantly though, they have a passive counter that triggers when certain conditions are met, such as killing enemies, collecting gold, or simply taking actions. When triggered enough times, you're rewarded. Some trinkets will restore your health, and others will provide you with bonus steps. Considering that you need to clear 100 floors, you'll need to make good use of their synergy in order to progress anywhere at all. If all of that was too much, the TLDR version is swirlies unlock new things and trinkets make you bigger, better, faster, stronger. Most of the unlocks are vital to progressing in the game, but some make you wonder why they were needed at all. For example, the second one unlocks the collection, bestiary, and entity pages. These could have been unlocked from the start and they would have simply been empty, so it's not like they had to hide anything important. Unlocking that was the last thing I could do on my first run though, as I promptly ran out of steps, causing the gods to decide that the quickest way to evict me from the tower was to simply make me no longer alive. We're presented with some stats that summarise the run and then shown the feat screen from earlier. In a weird design choice, not only is there no music playing here, the rewards need to be manually collected, otherwise you will simply miss out on them. At this point, we've covered the core gameplay loop, but there are still some important things to unlock that add a lot more depth to the game that I want to cover, and there are quite a few flaws that I want to cover as well. On the second run, thanks to the trinkets restoring some steps along the way, I make it to floor 10, and it's here that some of the real challenge of the game becomes apparent. You see, on every 10th floor, the door is locked until a mini-boss style enemy is slain. I say mini-boss, but they are really just a higher tier version of enemies you've seen before. On the lower levels, it's pretty obvious which enemy needs to be killed, just look for the biggest one in the room. However, this gets more and more murky the higher you climb, and there isn't any kind of indicator to hint at which enemy needs to be killed to progress. To make matters worse, if you spend too long on a single floor, dark wizards start to appear, and they are able to summon a monster almost every turn. Yes, you can theoretically abuse this mechanic to grind huge amounts of gold, but as soon as a wizard summons another wizard, things start to snowball out of control pretty quickly. And if this happens before you've killed the correct enemy to unlock the door, well, that's just bad luck. In this run, I managed to kill the enemy, making it to the 11th floor before collapsing from exhaustion. Sadly though, I didn't find any swirlies, but I did complete a few feats, gaining a few more unlocks as a result. The third run fared slightly better, finding a swirly tile on the 3rd floor. This tells me that their appearance is randomized rather than appearing on set floors, and personally, I'm not a fan of this. Leaving the unlocking of core mechanics to complete chance means that some players may get stuck and unable to progress until they happen to get lucky and find them. I think it would have been more sensible to space them out on specific floors, acting as rewards that entice the player to climb a bit higher to find the next one. This system also means that even after progressing much further into the tower, I was wondering if there was still more mechanics left to unlock. Or maybe it's just a skill issue. As it turns out, this specific one is a literal game changer, unlocking unique abilities for each character, a useful unlock right now even though we only have one character available. The adventurer's unique ability allows them to gain permanent stat upgrades after killing a specific number of monsters. My personal favourite was the Coin Master, who gains massive stat increases the higher their accumulated gold rises. I found that it made for a nice risk-reward system where the player is forced to weigh each and every purchase, especially when some very enticing items are for sale at the merchant. Anyway, this run finds another swirly tile on the 5th floor, finally unlocking the most important system: power-ups. Each completed run rewards the player with shards, and now these can be spent on permanent upgrades. We're talking things like bonus damage to specific enemy types, rewards for destroying objects, more uses for specific item types, and much more. Unlocks are on a tiered system, with each new tier requiring a specific number of unlocks from the previous tiers to become available. I found that this prevented choice paralysis early on and allowed for a natural progression of complexity that lined up nicely with the player naturally discovering more about the game through playing. That said, I don't understand why this system needed to be unlocked instead of being available from the start. A big factor for the player drop-off in a game is a lack of perceived progression towards a goal, and here, there is a chance that the player may have attempted 5 or more runs before finding and unlocking this system, essentially hamstringing their progress significantly. In fact, I think that in general the swirly unlock system is well intentioned, but poorly implemented and poorly explained. Having a more transparent system where the player can see what can be unlocked and how would provide the player with motivation to progress, rather than leaving them in the dark about key systems that will enable them to feel a sense of accomplishment. Anyway, this run ends on floor 10, but does finally unlock the second character, the assassin. In order to speed things up, let's shift focus slightly to some of the other mechanics so that you can appreciate the level of complexity here, but also how weirdly surface level it all is. As you continue playing, you will unlock more weapons, potions, and trinkets. Some of these are outright upgrades compared to the basic versions, such as melee weapons that have higher durability and damage than the starter sword. You'll also unlock item rarities, allowing upgraded versions of all items, including coin pouches, to have a chance of appearing. These rare versions of items are always worth having, as they offer more durability, range, area of effect, and even additional status effects over their basic counterparts. This also applies to trinkets, which receive a few other mechanics. You receive a bonus for slotting a trinket with the correct stat into the correct space. This has a double-edged sword effect of reducing player choice but increasing character identity, as they limit what trinkets a given character should use. Additionally, by using alters, a trinket can be sacrificed to add one of its stats to another trinket. Interesting in theory, but ultimately unwieldy as a system, as each trinket can only be upgraded in this way once. And as the sacrifice trinket must be in your inventory, you'll only ever be able to have 3 out of 4 trinkets upgraded at any time. The notebook is another game-changing system, as it allows you to summon various objects such as themed chests for specific types of items, vendors, or just instantly repair all of your gear. It's incredibly simple in terms of what it offers, but incredibly powerful. The ability to repair everything at any time is not to be underestimated, especially considering that I died at the final boss the first time, simply because all my equipment was broken. One of the stranger unlocks are trap tiles, effectively making each floor more dangerous to navigate for both yourself and your enemies. They aren't particularly deadly though, so end up being more of a nuisance than a threat, but if they annoy you, then good news. There is a new trinket with the fly ability that allows you to ignore all of them. It's worth noting that the water tiles do actually serve 2 functions, in addition to just being an obstacle to navigate around. You can use a fishing rod on them for a chance of getting a random item, or you can freeze them with an ice attack to simply walk over them. Sadly, these are the only tiles to interact with elemental attacks in any way, so it's a bit of a missed opportunity. One other obstacle with a hidden function is the sword in the stone. This is a later game unlock, and while the odds seem to be pretty low, with a bit of luck, you can actually take the sword, which is an incredibly powerful melee weapon. However, the real best weapons and trinkets in the game are hidden behind one last mechanic: cursed mode. Should you prove yourself to be slightly too good at the game and manage to increase your step counter above the starting 100, you'll find that things take a slightly darker turn as you evidently show utter disregard and contempt for the gods. Not only will enemies become stronger, but vendors and loot become corrupted as well. Cursed blacksmiths are able to upgrade trinkets to a 3rd level, increasing the stat boost even further, but they can no longer be merged at the altar. Vendors and chests now have a chance of containing cursed items that are incredibly powerful and not available anywhere else. However, they have significant trade-offs, having effects that trigger consistently and drain your step counter. This means that although you could easily acquire these items early on, chances are that you're much better off waiting until around floor 80 or so to start the search for cursed items. If you're able to get your hands on 1 or 2, you'll probably breeze through the final boss that awaits on the 100th floor, Orchestra. Not only does Orchestra have a massive attack range, but she also hits like a truck, soaks up damage like there's no tomorrow, and summons monsters like she's throwing an end-of-the-world party. If you're unprepared, this is pretty unpleasant. But with the right gear and some repair spells in the notebook, she's not too much of a challenge to take down. So, what's your reward for all of this? How does a thank you message and some shards for purchasing upgrades sound? There's no fanfare, no ending cutscene, no special unlocks. You do get a character-specific achievement though, so if you're trying to 100% this game, you will need to be Orchestra with all 10 characters, and a single run can take around 1 to 2 hours, so prepare to invest some significant time to make it happen. Climbing to the top of the tower and defeating Orchestra did place me in 8th position on the global leaderboards, only 17 points away from 7th place, but still somehow having a score nearly 4.5 times worse than the current best player, Tonix. Oh, and I somehow found 38 out of 37 entities, so that's fun. Guess I'll do another run. until now, we've really only been touching on the mechanics of the game, so let's now look at what works and doesn't work, because like a duck on a lake, everything looks fine on the surface, but not so much underneath. In isolation, each of the mechanics discussed previously sound good. However, the reality is that the majority of the systems and mechanics don't directly interact with each other, so it all feels a bit disjointed and messy. When they say that something is greater than the sum of its parts, it's because of a simple, very corporate sounding word: synergy. We're not talking about how well HR and IT managed to collaborate on the latest updates to the employee onboarding experience, but instead, how well any two systems are able to interact with each other. For example, let's look at the trinkets and the weapons. In terms of synergy, the only example we have is that some trinkets have special effects that are triggered by killing enemies, and you need weapons to kill enemies. All other trinkets are triggered by things like moving, obtaining gold, or spending gold. Yes, trinkets have additional stats that have effects like increasing weapon range, but that's not unique to the trinkets themselves. I would have loved an effect on a trinket like melee attacks now cleave enemies, ranged attacks can select up to 3 targets, or melee attacks have a 50% chance of pushing an enemy back 2 tiles. Effects like these allow for more tactics, changing the way the game is played at a fundamental level, and that's something this game is sorely missing. Whether you're on floor 1 or floor 100, the combat feels largely the same. Numbers get bigger, but you'll never really have a chance to flex. I think this is a trap that a lot of developers fall into, making upgrade systems that only provide numerical or percentage stat increases. Gaining a 1% increase to health, strength, or agility doesn't feel nearly as impactful as unlocking a trait that gives a 5% chance to insta-kill an enemy after dealing damage above a certain threshold. If you look at games like Risk of Rain 2, the item system is designed in such a way that the majority of desirable items are based around a structure of when X happens, Y happens. And that right there is why there is magic in the game, because it keeps things feeling fresh and creative. If you reward the player only with bigger numbers, you're preventing them from being creative and feeling smart by beating the game. Only you know that they're beating the game in a way that you're letting them. It's part of why, as much as I love old school RuneScape, I find the early game combat boring. It's just your numbers against theirs. And that's what the combat, and hence the majority of 100 steps, feels like. And as a result, in the later levels, if you get stuck with a bunch of strong monsters, you feel bad because you're losing as a result of your numbers being lower than theirs, and there isn't a way to outmaneuver them, no opportunity for clutch wins because an ability with a small chance of activating finally triggered. This is layered on top of many other issues that the game has, as it does suffer from a lack of polish. There are only 2 music tracks in the game, one that plays in the main menu and one that plays when climbing the tower. It's pleasant, but it does get repetitive. The character art looks great, but have stiff animations and only ever face one direction, making them feel incredibly fake and surface level. The sound effects are also limited, with attack sounds not matching the weapon being used, and the same sound effect is used when taking damage no matter which character you are playing as. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that a wealthy merchant, a fox, and a horrific abomination that wears spikes through their body like some kind of alt-punk fashion accessory would not make the same sound when being slapped by a giant tree. Pathing when moving long distances is pretty annoying, as you can't choose a specific route, only an end destination, and this ends up being incredibly frustrating when you can't move to a tile you want because the pathing thinks the best way there is to go over 5 traps. I would have preferred a movement system similar to the Fire Emblem series, where you can see your maximum range and then plot your path tile by tile. Yes, it might be slightly more tedious, but allows for more precision and control, which in this case is a worthwhile trade-off. There are many other small issues, like particle effects overlaying on top of objects when it should be behind them, or duplicated text, but the most egregious one in my eyes is a lack of a save function when climbing the tower. You can quit the game at any time, but if you do, your progress won't be saved. Not only that, you won't receive any shards either. However, if instead of quitting you simply allow yourself to die, then you do get shards. Considering that a run from floor 1 to floor 100 can take up to 2 hours to complete, not being able to save at floor 80 because it's nearly midnight and you made it further than you expected is pretty frustrating. When thinking about the game as a whole though, none of these issues are game-breaking. There are missed opportunities, balancing issues, odd design choices, and rough edges that need polishing. There are a few interesting ideas at the core of the game, although I'm sure that someone in the comments will tell me that it's actually all been done before in another game, but it's new to me, and I can only speak from my experience after all. If roguelite style games are your jam and you're comfortable with looking past some flaws to support an indie dev and try something new, then I think you'll have a pretty good time here. Completing the game took just over 8 hours of playtime, and for $5.95 dues, that's pretty decent. But do keep in mind, I wouldn't go to the lengths of beating the game with every character. And that's why my final rating for 100 steps is Primigenian Bark out of 10. It's got a sturdy foundation and feels comfortable to hold, but quickly discarded in favour of more robust and refined alternatives. Thanks for watching. Welcome to the end of the video. Thank you to all the members on screen for supporting the channel, and a shout out to our noble knights Azazel, Bull, Lampirides, Lexus LFA 554, Negi Malevolent, and the Crabs. And as always, a special thank you to our Knight of the Holy Grail, Freaky Feline. That's all for now, so if you made it this far, here's a sneak peek of the next game, and until next time, take care.